You have the results for the 6 months for the period ended 30th of June, and I give us what I imagine are some pretty horrific numbers. I was going to say regarding footfall, it's probably not called footfall. I imagine it's passenger numbers, is it, Mr. Holland-Kaye? Good morning.
Absolutely, yes, Nick. I've been used to coming on your show and talking about the record performance at Heathrow, and unfortunately, the record we have is not one I'm happy to see, which is a £1.1 billion loss in the first half of this year, because very few people were flying in the second quarter. Really, this shows how devastating COVID has been for the aviation sector as a whole, as it has been for many other companies in the economy, as we were just hearing about. And as a small island trading nation, we absolutely need to get people flying again in a safe way. We need to get our goods coming in and out of the country. And the kind of testing you were just talking about is a very sensible way forward to see if we can make sure that we can travel to what are considered to be red countries, which includes not just Spain, but also places like the United States, and get our goods moving again between here and the United States, but do it in a way that keeps people safe.
We were speaking earlier in the hour, Mr. Holland-Kaye, with one of the bosses at Collinson, which is a company that I think is working with you and with Swissport. How far down the line do you understand these tests to be? How long would it take if the government were to approve it to actually be in place?
Well, that's right. We've been working with Swissport Collinson for nearly a month now, and we would be ready to go with a PCR test, which is a test to see whether you have COVID at the airport, and we could have that up and running within the next 2 weeks, provided that the government allow us to do that and put a legislation in place, which would mean that if someone tests clear of COVID, they would be allowed to get out of quarantine early. And at this stage, this isn't a single test where you just have the test at the airport and then go on your way. There would probably need to be 2 tests, one at day one on arrival, the second maybe 5 or 8 days later. So you'd still need to go into quarantine. But if you were clear on both those tests, then you would be allowed to get out of quarantine earlier. And this is something that is being done at other countries. As we learn more about this, we could start potentially to reduce the amount of time between those 2 tests, but probably to keep people safe and err on the side of caution, we need to start with a 5 or 8 day test.
What percentage is your airport running at the moment of passenger numbers?
Well, today we're down by about 85%. With the risk-based approach that the government's put in place, about 30% of our markets are considered to be green or amber, and people can fly to and from those countries without going into quarantine. So that immediately cuts our capacity significantly. A lot of people are still flying to those countries, and I think people are a little anxious maybe about making their first flight. But when they get to the airport, they see the measures that are in place, they quickly relax. And actually, the reports I've had is that people have enjoyed the experience. So once we can open up countries again, we can get people flying again in a safe way, and we can get closer to business as usual and protect millions of jobs in this country.
Your view of the blanket quarantine measures we've seen in Spain, Mr. Holland-Kaye?
Well, it's disappointing that we have to have a blanket quarantine for the entire country, including the islands, given that the outbreaks are quite localized. And we could understand that for the first wave of the crisis, because the responses by individual countries were on a blanket basis. But what we're seeing with second waves is that there's a much more targeted approach. It's Barcelona that gets closed down, or in our case, some of our cities, not the entire country. And that suggests that we should have a much more targeted approach to any quarantine measures, particularly when it comes to a country the size of Spain with its islands. And when we think about somewhere like the US, it's an entire continent. We know that there are some parts of the US where the disease levels are high, and we need to have testing before we allow people in from them. But is that the case with New York or with Chicago? I think we need a much more regional approach to opening up countries.